I never planned to fall in love with a married woman. I didn't even plan to fall in love at all. My life had been built on discipline, silence, and anticipation, knowing what others needed before they asked, disappearing before I became a complication. I learned early that being too much had consequences, so I became precise, useful, forgettable. I was the woman who entered rooms full of powerful men and left them running smoothly without anyone remembering I'd been there. Until the day Evelyn looked at me like I was fully alive. And in that quiet moment, everything I thought was protecting me began to crack. Before I go on, let me ask you something real. If you're drawn to stories about complicated love, quiet betrayals, and women who finally stop shrinking to survive, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I read every single one, maybe because for a long time, I was invisible too. My name is Layla. I'm 32 years old, and I work as the personal assistant to a rising political figure in California. That means living on alert, managing crises before they exist, speaking carefully, smiling only when necessary. It means knowing when to vanish. I was good at it. So good that sometimes I forgot I had a body at all. My boss trusted me because I never complicated things. The press ignored me. And his wife. His wife existed to me only as a name on seating charts and formal invitations, until she didn't. Evelyn showed up one Tuesday morning without warning. She wore a pale, tailored suit that looked too soft for our steel gray office. She didn't ask for coffee, didn't ask for anything. She just observed. There was something about the way she stood, quiet, composed, but not small, that didn't fit the role of the politician's wife. It wasn't submission. It wasn't entitlement. It was exhaustion. When our eyes met, I felt an unfamiliar tension, like I'd been caught staring into a mirror I hadn't asked for. After that, she appeared more often. Meetings that didn't require her presence. Official trips where she could have stayed home. Always polite. Always restrained. Our conversation stayed neutral. Logistics, schedules, harmless comments. But the silences stretched too long. The pauses lingered. And I, who had mastered timing, started missing the rhythm. I stayed a second longer than necessary. Lowered my voice without realizing it. It felt like something in me recognized something in her long before my mind could intervene. The first real conversation happened late one night in a hotel corridor. My boss was asleep. The staff had scattered to their rooms. Evelyn asked me if I ever got tired of pretending. She didn't explain what she meant. She didn't have to. I told her pretending was part of the job. She smiled, but it wasn't relief. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they've heard that answer their whole life and never believed it. After that, things shifted quietly. She began sitting beside me instead of across the room, asking questions that had nothing to do with schedules or appearances. She listened in a way that unsettled me, not impatient, not polite, but present. I noticed how carefully she held herself, as if every movement had been negotiated long ago. I told myself it meant nothing, that proximity doesn't equal desire, that attention isn't intimacy. But my body disagreed long before my logic did. She never touched me, not once. And that was somehow worse, because it meant everything was happening in the open space between us, unspoken, undeniable. I started noticing the way she breathed when she laughed, how her shoulders dropped when she felt safe, how she watched me when she thought I wasn't looking. I had spent years making myself invisible, and suddenly I was being seen without trying. The first time she said it, her voice didn't shake. I'm married. It wasn't a confession. It was a boundary. A reminder. I nodded, professional as always. But something in her eyes contradicted the words. I understood then that marriage, for her, wasn't a choice. It was a structure. And structures don't disappear just because the truth knocks. I should have stepped back. I should have reasserted the distance that had always kept me safe. But once you realize you've been living half alive, safety starts to feel like another kind of prison. And without either of us saying it out loud, we crossed a line that had nothing to do with touch, and everything to do with recognition. I didn't mean for it to start with something so small. That's what makes it embarrassing to admit now. How the beginning wasn't a kiss or a confession, but a moment of attention I wasn't used to receiving. After that first Tuesday, Evelyn didn't disappear back into the curated life she was supposed to live. She started showing up in the seams of my days, in the places where only staff existed. The hallway outside my office, the back entrance of a venue, the quiet edge of a fundraiser where the cameras didn't aim. She never demanded anything. She just arrived. And somehow the air changed when she did. A week later, we were prepping for a coastal town hall event, the kind my boss loved because it made him look accessible. My phone buzzed every 30 seconds. I was juggling security updates, the motorcade schedule, and last-minute donor requests when Evelyn stepped into my doorway. She didn't knock. She didn't hover. She leaned lightly against the frame, watching me like I wasn't a machine. "You're going to forget to eat," she said, not accusing, observing. I gave her the answer I always gave. "I'm fine." She didn't argue. She just placed a small paper bag on the corner of my desk and walked away. Inside was a croissant that was still warm, and a coffee with exactly the right amount of cream. I stared at it like it was evidence. People in my world didn't remember things like that. Not about me. They remembered which senator hated being kept waiting, which donor needed reassurance, which reporter could be bought with access. Evelyn remembered what my hands looked like when they were shaking, even if I pretended they weren't. I took one bite, and the strange part was how my throat tightened. Not from hunger, but from the feeling of being cared for without being owed. On the flight north, she sat 2 rows behind my boss, far enough to be proper, close enough to see me when I turned. The plane hummed, the staff murmured, and I worked through talking points on my tablet. I felt her gaze before I saw it. When I looked up, she wasn't staring in a way that demanded anything. She was simply there, eyes steady, expression unreadable but soft. I dropped my eyes back to the screen and told myself it meant nothing. Then my pulse jumped anyway, like my body had decided it didn't believe me. At the hotel, the staff moved like shadows, trained to make everything seamless. Evelyn caught me by the elevator after my boss disappeared into his suite. "Walk with me," she said. Not a question, not an order. A request that sounded like she already knew I'd say yes. We took the long corridor toward the back of the building where there were no photos on the walls, no floral arrangements, no performance, just carpeting and quiet. She didn't talk for the first few steps. When she finally did, her voice was low. "Do you ever miss being a person?" I almost laughed. Almost. "I'm a person," I said automatically. She turned her head slightly, just enough to let me see the truth in her face. "No," she said gently. "You're a function." That word hit harder than it should have. Function. I'd spent years perfecting it. It was my survival strategy, my armor. Evelyn said it like she was naming something she recognized because she wore the same thing. I stopped walking without meaning to. She stopped too. The hallway felt suddenly narrower, like the walls were listening. I wanted to deny it, to turn back into the safe version of myself. But I couldn't. "It's easier," I admitted. "If I'm a function, no one can hurt me." Her mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. "And does it work?" she asked. I didn't answer, because the answer was standing in front of me. The next day was all optics. My boss shook hands, laughed on cue, made promises that sounded like compassion. Evelyn stood beside him in a pale dress that made her look like a portrait of stability. I stood behind them, half a step back, scanning the crowd, making sure nothing broke the illusion. At one point, a woman pushed through the line too aggressively, trying to get close, and I moved instinctively to block. My hand lifted, professional, quick, and Evelyn's fingers closed around my wrist. Not to stop me, to ground me. Her touch was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a heat up my arm that had nothing to do with adrenaline. She released me before anyone could notice. I kept my face neutral, inside something unspooled. That night, there was a small donor dinner, private, exclusive, expensive enough to feel like a threat. I stood near the wall, watching the room, waiting for my boss to need me. Evelyn drifted away from the table and found her way to where I was standing, like she was pulled there. "Do you ever feel lonely?" she asked. So quietly it could have been mistaken for the clink of glassware. I should have deflected. I should have lied. Instead I said, "All the time." Her eyes stayed on mine. "Me too," she whispered. And then, as if realizing how dangerous it was to say that out loud, she looked away and stared at the room like it was an ocean she didn't know how to cross. After that, the closeness became routine, and that's what scared me most. It wasn't a dramatic fall. It was a gradual rearranging of my life around her presence. She'd sit beside me in cars instead of across. She'd ask my opinion on things that didn't matter politically. Music, books, which part of the coastline felt like freedom. Once, on a long drive back from a rally, she asked what I'd wanted to be when I was little. I froze, because no one had asked me that in years. "I don't know," I said. She didn't let me off the hook. "You do," she insisted, calm. I swallowed. "I wanted to write," I admitted. Saying it felt like revealing a bruise. Her hand hovered between us on the center console. Palm up, not touching me, just offered. The car was quiet except for the road, and the driver's focus was ahead. I stared at her hand like it was the most reckless thing I'd ever seen. In my mind, every rule I'd survived by started screaming. Don't. Not this. Not her. Not now. But my fingers moved anyway, slow and cautious, resting against her palm. It wasn't a grip. It wasn't a declaration. It was contact. Warm. Human. Real. Her thumb brushed once, lightly, over my knuckles. And I felt the sharp, dizzy truth of it. I wasn't invisible to her, and I didn't know how to go back to being invisible after that. By the end of the week, I was sleeping less, not because of work, but because my mind wouldn't stop replaying small moments like they were scenes from another life. Evelyn's laugh when she tried to hide it. The way she said my name like it mattered. The way her eyes searched my face when she thought I might disappear again. And I kept telling myself it was temporary. An emotional glitch, stress, proximity. But deep down, something quieter and more honest was already forming, the knowledge that I was beginning to want her. Not in a way that could be explained away, in a way that asked for consequences. The awareness between us didn't arrive dramatically. It settled in. After that first touch in the car, nothing outward changed. No rules were broken, no lines crossed, but everything underneath did. I started noticing Evelyn before I saw her. The shift in the room, the way conversations softened when she entered. It was subtle enough to deny, but constant enough to feel. Our days overlapped more than before, though always for reasonable reasons. Planning meetings, fundraisers, community events where my boss needed to look accessible and composed. Evelyn began staying longer, lingering after the speeches ended, drifting toward where I stood instead of returning immediately to his side. We spoke quietly, often about nothing important, and somehow that made it intimate. It felt like choosing each other inside the noise. One afternoon, while staff packed up after a local education roundtable, Evelyn sat beside me in the nearly empty room. Chairs stacked, lights dimmed. "Do you ever get tired of knowing what everyone needs?" she asked. The question caught me off guard, not because it was personal, but because it was accurate. "That's my job," I said automatically. She looked at me then, her expression thoughtful. "And who takes care of you?" The answer lodged in my throat. "No one," I thought, but I didn't say it out loud. We began finding moments like that. Brief, unplanned pockets of honesty, in hallways, at the edge of events. Once, waiting for my boss to finish a call, Evelyn told me she missed feeling excited about ordinary things. "I used to love mornings," she said. "Now they just feel scheduled." I wanted to tell her that mornings could be reclaimed, that life didn't have to feel like a performance. Instead, I listened. Being heard mattered more than being saved. The physical closeness increased without either of us acknowledging it. Sitting nearer than necessary, standing too close during conversations. I became aware of her scent, something clean and soft, nothing overpowering, and the way my body responded before my mind could intervene. Once, our knees brushed under a table. It was accidental. We both froze. She inhaled sharply. I didn't move away. Neither did she. When we finally separated, it felt like leaving something unfinished. At a small evening reception, Evelyn found me near the back of the room, where the lights were low and the crowd blurred. "You look tired," she said, her voice gentle. I smiled, the polite version I wore like armor. She shook her head slightly. "Not that one," she murmured. I let the smile fall. The relief on her face was immediate, as if she'd been waiting for that permission. That was when I understood how carefully she'd been watching me, and how much that mattered. We walked outside afterward, just a few steps onto the quiet sidewalk, while staff wrapped up inside. The city hummed around us, distant traffic and muted voices. She folded her arms, more vulnerable than I'd seen her. "I feel like I've been living someone else's life," she said. "I didn't try to fix it. I didn't offer solutions. I just said, I know that feeling." She turned to me then, surprised. "You do?" I nodded. "Every day." She didn't reach for me. She didn't need to. The understanding was enough to make my chest ache. "I shouldn't be saying this," she said softly, "but being around you feels honest." The words settled between us, fragile and undeniable. I swallowed. "It feels that way to me too," I admitted. Saying it out loud made it real in a way I couldn't undo. There was a pause then. Long, weighted, the kind where either person could step back and choose safety. Evelyn's gaze dropped briefly to my mouth before returning to my eyes. Her breath slowed, then steadied. I'm married, she said, quietly but firmly. Not as a shield, as a truth. I nodded, my voice calm despite the rush inside me. I know. We stood there, the line between us clear and dangerously close. When we went back inside, nothing had changed on the surface, but I felt altered, as if I'd crossed an internal threshold. Recognition had replaced doubt. What we felt was mutual, not imagined, not one-sided, and that knowledge carried its own gravity. I understood then that the real danger wasn't the possibility of crossing the line, it was the certainty that we both already knew where it was. That night, lying awake, I replayed her words, her nearness, the way my body responded to being seen without being claimed. I knew this wasn't something that would fade on its own. We hadn't touched, we hadn't kissed, but we had acknowledged each other. And that was enough to change everything that came next. The shift didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, like everything else between us. After that night of shared honesty, Evelyn didn't pull away, and neither did I. If anything, the distance we had been carefully maintaining became harder to sustain. There was a new gravity to our proximity, a shared awareness that made every interaction feel intentional, even when we pretended it wasn't. We moved through the next few days with practiced restraint. Meetings, calls, public appearances, everything unfolded as it always had. But underneath, something waited. When Evelyn spoke, her voice carried a softness meant only for me. When I handed her a folder or leaned in to clarify a detail, the air between us tightened. It wasn't impatience, it was anticipation, held back by choice rather than fear. The moment came on an ordinary evening, which felt fitting somehow. A small community fundraiser wrapped earlier than expected, staff dispersed. My boss was delayed on a call. Evelyn lingered near the back of the venue, her posture looser than usual, as if the weight of the day had finally eased. "Can you walk me out?" she asked. Not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. I nodded, already aware of the quiet inevitability in her tone. Outside, the evening was mild, the kind of calm that settles after activity fades. Streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk. We stood near the entrance, neither of us rushing to leave. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her eyes fixed somewhere just past my shoulder. "About knowing what it feels like to live a life that doesn't quite belong to you." I felt my chest tighten. "And?" I asked softly. She turned then, fully, and met my gaze. It made me realize how long I've been pretending not to notice what I want. The honesty in her voice stripped away the last of my defenses. I didn't step closer. I didn't need to. "I don't want to pressure you," I said. "I know what this costs." She shook her head gently. "You're not pressuring me," she replied. "You're the first person who hasn't." The admission hung between us, fragile and brave. I saw then how much courage it took for her to say that, to stand there without the protection of role or expectation. For a moment, we simply breathed. The city moved around us, unaware. Evelyn lifted her hand slightly, hesitated, then let it fall back to her side. I mirrored the restraint, even as my body leaned toward hers without permission. Our closeness felt electric, not rushed, not reckless, just unbearably present. "Layla," she said, my name soft and deliberate. "If we do this—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. "I know," I said. My voice didn't waver. That was the truth. I knew exactly what it meant. I also knew what it would mean not to. Evelyn's eyes searched mine one last time, as if confirming something she'd already decided. Then she stepped forward, closing the distance we had been circling for weeks. The kiss wasn't urgent. It was careful. Her lips touched mine like a question, slow and tentative, giving me space to pull away. I didn't. I stayed, hands still at my sides, letting the moment expand instead of collapse. When I finally responded, it was gentle, intentional, an answer rather than an impulse. The world narrowed to breath and warmth, and the quiet certainty that this was real. She pulled back first, just enough to look at me. Her eyes were glossy, her expression open in a way I hadn't seen before. "I shouldn't," she whispered. Not as a warning, but as a confession. I nodded, my forehead resting lightly against hers. "I know," I replied. The words didn't undo what we'd done. They simply acknowledged the truth around it. We didn't kiss again. Not then. That restraint felt important, grounding. Evelyn took a step back, steadying herself. "This changes things," she said. I exhaled slowly. Yes, I agreed. It does. Neither of us pretended otherwise. The honesty of that moment mattered more than any promise. When she left, I stayed where I was, listening to my heartbeat settle into a new rhythm. I wasn't confused. I wasn't ashamed. I was aware, fully, unmistakably aware, that something irreversible had begun. We hadn't crossed every line, but we had crossed the one that mattered most. And from that point on, there would be no pretending this was just proximity or coincidence. I went home knowing one thing with clarity I'd never had before. Whatever came next would require courage from both of us. The kiss hadn't been a mistake, it had been a decision. Quiet, mutual, and deeply felt. And I understood, with a mix of fear and anticipation, that this was only the beginning. What followed the kiss wasn't chaos. It was precision. We didn't rush into anything dramatic or reckless. If anything, we became more careful. So careful it felt deliberate. The space between us filled with quiet agreements we never spoke out loud. When to look, when not to. How long was too long? What corners of a room were safe? Our relationship didn't announce itself. It threaded its way into the margins of our lives. We learned each other in fragments, a hand brushing my lower back when no one was watching. A note slipped into my folder with nothing written on it but my name, in her handwriting, the way she'd paused just slightly before saying goodbye. As if memorizing my face, these weren't accidents. They were chosen moments, carved out of schedules built to erase intimacy. And somehow that made them feel more real. Our first night together happened without ceremony. No dramatic setup, no stolen weekend, just a late evening when my boss was working long hours, staff had cleared out, and Evelyn showed up at my apartment unannounced. She stood in the doorway like she was bracing for rejection. I didn't ask why she came. I stepped aside and let her in. That felt like the truest answer I could give. Inside, everything slowed. We spoke quietly, voices low, like the walls might be listening. When she touched me, it was with reverence, not urgency. As if she was discovering something she'd been denied permission to want. The intimacy between us wasn't about hunger alone. It was about relief, about finally exhaling. We moved together carefully, learning, listening. When we slept, her arm rested across my waist like it belonged there. I didn't wake her when I watched her breathe. After that, secrecy became structure. We didn't text openly. We used neutral language. Times were planned with precision. If someone saw us together, it looked professional. If someone overheard us, it sounded harmless. And yet, in the privacy of my apartment or the brief sanctuary of her car, parked a block away from everything familiar, we were honest. She laughed more with me. I spoke more freely with her. We weren't escaping our lives. We were inhabiting ourselves inside them. Evelyn began to change, subtle at first. She wore softer colors, asked more questions, interrupted my boss once, gently but firmly, when he spoke over her. I watched that moment from across the room, my chest tightening with pride and fear in equal measure. Later, she squeezed my hand once in the hallway, quick and unseen. "That was because of you," she said. I shook my head. "It was already in you." She smiled like she'd just remembered something important, but with closeness came vigilance. We listened for footsteps. We checked reflections in glass. We learned which doors closed quietly and which didn't. Once, during a meeting, my boss glanced between us a second too long. It meant nothing, or it meant everything. I felt my spine stiffen. Evelyn didn't react, but that night she held me tighter than usual. "Do you think he knows?" she whispered. I didn't answer right away. "I think he knows something is different," I said carefully. The distinction mattered. Fear didn't stop us, it sharpened us. Every meeting felt more intentional. Every goodbye heavier. Sometimes we argued in whispers. About risk, about timing, about how long this could last, but even those disagreements were threaded with care. We weren't using each other. We were choosing each other again and again, in small, deliberate ways. There were moments of pure normalcy that felt almost dangerous in their simplicity. Cooking together, sharing music, falling asleep mid-conversation. Once, she traced circles on my shoulder and said, "I didn't know it could feel like this." I didn't ask what she meant. I knew. It felt like being met instead of managed, like existing without apology. Still, the world pressed close. Invitations piled up. Appearances increased. My boss's campaign gained momentum. With every step forward publicly, our private space narrowed. I began to sense that the bubble we'd built couldn't hold forever, not because the love wasn't strong, but because it was. Powerful things attract attention, even when they try not to. One night, after Evelyn left, I stood by the window and watched her car disappear down the street. For the first time since this began, I felt a sharp edge of fear I couldn't soften. Loving her wasn't the danger. Being seen loving her was. And I understood then that secrecy wasn't just a phase. It was a fragile balance that could tip at any moment. I went to bed knowing this chapter of us was beautiful, real, and unsustainable as it was. We were no longer circling the truth. We were living inside it, and sooner or later the truth would demand to be answered. Not in whispers, but in consequences. It didn't start with accusations. It never does. It started with observation. A pause that lingered too long, a question asked twice, a look that stayed just a second past polite. My boss had always been perceptive when it came to threats. Political, strategic, external. What he was slower to recognize were the quiet shifts that happened inside his own life. But once he noticed, he didn't miss details. The first sign came during a planning meeting. Evelyn spoke up. Nothing dramatic, just a gentle correction to something he'd said. The room went still. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Afterward, in the hallway, he asked me if she'd been feeling well lately. The phrasing was careful, concerned. I answered with neutral efficiency. She's been busy. He nodded, like he was filing the response away rather than accepting it. From that point on, his attention sharpened. He began appearing unexpectedly, walking into rooms without announcing himself, watching Evelyn when he thought no one noticed. I felt it like pressure in my chest. A constant low-grade alarm. Evelyn sensed it too. She grew quieter in public, more guarded. In private, she held me like she was memorizing my shape. "He's watching," she whispered one night. I kissed her hair and told her we were careful. The words sounded thinner than I wanted them to. Our routines adjusted instinctively. Fewer texts, shorter meetings. We avoided being alone in places that felt exposed. When we did see each other, it was in stolen intervals that felt compressed by fear. Desire didn't disappear, but it changed. It became more urgent, threaded with the awareness that time might be running out. We touched like people bracing for impact. The first direct question came over dinner. I wasn't there, but Evelyn told me later, her voice tight. He asked if she was unhappy, not angrily, not accusingly, like someone testing the temperature of water before stepping in. She said she didn't answer right away. Silence had always been her shield, but that night, silence had weight. He pressed gently, then stopped. That restraint scared her more than shouting would have. At work, I felt myself being assessed. Invitations excluded me, then included me again. I was asked to clarify things I'd already clarified, to explain decisions that had never required explanation before. It wasn't hostility, it was scrutiny, the kind that searches for pattern, for motive. I started replaying my movements in my head, checking for cracks. Had I stood too close? Lingered too long? Let something slip in my tone? Evelyn and I argued for the first time because of it. Not loudly. Never loudly. She wanted distance. I wanted reassurance. If we disappear from each other completely, he'll notice that too, I said. She looked at me with eyes full of conflict. If he notices us at all, it could destroy everything. I reached for her, then stopped myself. The space between us felt heavier than touch. Fear has a way of distorting love. It didn't make us careless, but it made us fragile. Small misunderstandings felt larger. Delays felt intentional. One night, she canceled plans at the last minute, her message brief and apologetic. I sat alone in my apartment, staring at my phone, wondering if this was how it would end. Not with exposure, but with erosion. When she finally called, her voice was raw. "I can't breathe tonight," she said. I told her to come anyway. She didn't. I understood. That didn't make it easier. The tension reached a new level at a public event where cameras crowded closer than usual. My boss stood beside Evelyn, his hand resting possessively at her back. She didn't pull away. She didn't lean in. She stayed still, composed. Her eyes found mine once across the room. Quick, controlled, filled with something like apology. I held her gaze just long enough to let her know I was still there, then I looked away. After that, nothing felt theoretical. We weren't just risking discovery, we were living inside it. Every interaction felt like it might be the one that tipped the balance. Evelyn began sleeping poorly. I could feel it in the way she held me when we did find time together, too tight, like she was afraid I might vanish. "What if this cost you everything?" she asked one night. I answered without hesitation. It already changed me. That's not a cost I regret. Still, I knew the truth she was circling. Love wasn't the danger anymore, exposure was. And the fear of it was beginning to shape our choices, narrowing our world in ways that felt unsustainable. I sensed that we were approaching a moment where something would have to give, either the secrecy or us. By the end of that week, I understood something clearly for the first time. We could no longer control the story simply by being careful. Someone else was watching now, and soon, observation would turn into action. The first warning didn't come from my boss. It came from the silence around him. Invitations shifted, schedules tightened. Information that used to flow easily now arrived filtered, delayed, or not at all. The campaign moved forward with a new caution, as if the walls had grown ears. I felt it everywhere, in the way staff lowered their voices, in the way meetings ended abruptly when I entered. This wasn't paranoia anymore. It was strategy. Evelyn sensed it before I named it. She always did. One afternoon, she met me near the service exit after an event. Her face pale beneath her composure. "They're watching me," she said, not looking at me directly. "Not like before." I asked who. She exhaled. "Everyone." The word landed hard. In public life, attention wasn't neutral. It was currency. And right now, it felt like debt. The first concrete threat came disguised as concern. A senior advisor pulled me aside, voice low, friendly. He mentioned optics, stress, the importance of avoiding distractions during a critical phase. He didn't say Evelyn's name. He didn't say mine. He didn't have to. The message was clear. If something existed, it needed to disappear or be dealt with. I thanked him and walked away with my spine straight, my hands shaking once I was alone. That night, Evelyn and I argued again, this time with urgency. She wanted to stop seeing me, temporarily, she said. Just until things settled. The word temporary tasted like a lie we both needed to survive. "If they find out," she said, voice breaking, "they won't come for you gently." I took her face in my hands, careful, desperate. "If we vanish now," I said, "they'll assume something existed worth hiding." The logic was cruel but true. We were trapped between visibility and absence. The pressure escalated quickly. A photo surfaced online, innocuous technically. Evelyn and I at the edge of a frame, blurred, not touching. But proximity has its own language. It circulated quietly among staff before disappearing. No headlines, no accusations, just proof that someone was looking in the right direction. I realized then how thin the line was between rumor and reality. At a public gala, the tension reached its breaking point. Cameras flashed constantly. My boss stayed close to Evelyn, attentive in a way that felt performative. She smiled when required. I managed logistics from the perimeter, my pulse loud in my ears. At one point, his gaze met mine, longer than necessary, sharp with calculation. It wasn't suspicion anymore, it was assessment. I understood that if he moved next, it would be deliberate. Later that night, Evelyn called me, her voice unsteady. "He asked if I was faithful," she said. The word felt archaic in this context, loaded with expectation rather than truth. She told him she was loyal. It wasn't a lie, not to herself. But the distinction didn't matter. He asked follow-up questions, not about me, about someone. She deflected as she always had. This time he didn't drop it. We met the next day in a place that felt almost ironic in its openness. A quiet cafe near a park, midday, nothing hidden. We sat across from each other like acquaintances, our knees carefully separated. "We can't keep doing this," she said, eyes glossy but determined. "Not like this." I knew what she meant. Love wasn't enough to outmaneuver power, and power was circling. I told her what I'd been considering but hadn't said out loud yet, that I could step away, that I could resign, remove myself from the equation. It was the first time I'd allowed the thought to form fully. Her reaction was immediate and fierce. "No," she said, "I won't let them erase you." The protectiveness in her voice nearly broke me. "Then what?" I asked softly. She didn't have an answer. Neither did I. The truth settled between us like gravity. The threat wasn't hypothetical anymore, it was imminent. If we stayed the course, someone would get hurt. If we changed it, we would. The choice wasn't between safety and love. It was between control and surrender. Evelyn reached across the table and touched my hand, openly this time, not caring who saw. "Whatever happens," she said, "don't doubt that this is real." I squeezed her fingers once, steadying both of us. "I never have," I replied. That night, alone in my apartment, I packed a box without deciding what it meant. Not resignation, not escape, preparation. I understood that the story we'd been living in the margins was about to be forced into the light, whether we were ready or not, and I knew, with a clarity that hurt, that the next step would change everything. I knew before I admitted it to myself. The moment things shifted from tension to surveillance, from fear to calculation, something inside me began preparing for departure. Not because I wanted to leave her, but because staying was starting to feel like the most dangerous choice we could make. I had spent my life learning how systems work, and I recognized this one too well. It wasn't a dramatic moment that decided it. It was subtle. A question asked with too much calm, a glance that lingered too long. An unfamiliar man near the edge of a meeting, watching Evelyn as if she were a variable instead of a person. I answered everything cleanly, professionally. But as I did, I felt it settle in my chest. They weren't guessing anymore. They were confirming. Evelyn felt it too. That night, when she came to my apartment, she didn't take off her coat right away. She stood near the door like someone who hadn't decided whether it was safe to breathe yet. I didn't ask what happened. I stepped closer, and she leaned into me without a word. Her body trembled slightly, and I hated how powerless that made me feel. Not because she was weak, but because the world around us was strong in the wrong way. "They're circling," she said finally, her voice low and strained. "He hasn't accused me. That's what scares me." I nodded. Accusations come after decisions. What comes before is evaluation. I brushed my thumb along her arm, slow and grounding. "I know," I said, and in that moment, the choice I'd been resisting crystallized into something unavoidable. I didn't want to be brave. I didn't want to be noble. I wanted to stay, to fight, to pretend love could outmaneuver power. But I also knew how this story would be written if I let it unfold without intervention. Evelyn would be protected by marriage, image, narrative. I would be erased quietly, turned into a lesson, a liability, a cautionary footnote, and once that happened, they would still own her. I didn't tell her that night. I held her instead, memorized the weight of her head against my shoulder, the way her breathing slowed when she felt safe. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was heavy with everything we were about to lose. The next morning, I requested a meeting with the campaign manager. I framed it the way people like him understand. Efficiency, timing, self-awareness, burnout, personal reasons. A clean exit. He didn't argue. That hurt more than resistance would have. It confirmed what I already knew. I was removable. Conveniently so. When I told Evelyn, I didn't soften it. I couldn't afford to. "I'm stepping away," I said. "From the campaign. From the office." She stared at me like I'd taken the ground out from under her. "You can't," she said immediately. "This isn't your fault." I shook my head. "That's exactly why it has to be me," I replied. "If they need someone to blame, I won't let it be you." Her control cracked then. She paced, her hands shaking, anger and fear tangling together. "So you leave," she said, voice sharp with pain. "And I stay here. With him, with them." I stepped closer, steady but firm. "You stay protected," I said, "and I stay intact." She looked at me like that wasn't enough. Maybe it wasn't. But it was the only option that didn't destroy us both. The goodbye wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and devastating. She held me like she was afraid I might disappear mid-breath. I held her back, anchoring us both, even as my chest burned. "This doesn't erase what we are," I told her softly. "It preserves it." She didn't answer. She just nodded against my shoulder, her tears warm against my skin. When she left, the apartment felt larger and emptier at the same time. I stood there long after the door closed, listening to the silence settle. I didn't feel heroic. I felt hollow. But underneath the ache, there was certainty. Loving her meant protecting her, even if that protection looked like absence. I went to bed alone that night knowing something irreversible had happened. Not the end of us, but the end of the way we had been, and I understood, with a painful clarity, that distance was now the last thing I could give her, that still meant love. I thought distance would quiet the noise. Instead, it sharpened everything. Without the campaign's constant urgency, time slowed enough for memories to surface uninvited. Evelyn's laugh when she forgot herself. The steadiness of her hand in mine, the way she said my name like it was something she'd chosen. I rebuilt my days carefully, one routine at a time, telling myself that rebuilding meant forward motion. It didn't stop me from listening for her voice in rooms where it couldn't exist. We didn't speak at first. That was the agreement we never negotiated, but both understood. Silence as shelter. I took contract work. I moved apartments. I learned the geography of a city that felt suddenly unfamiliar without the gravity of her presence. And still, every quiet felt provisional, like a pause before a decision I wasn't allowed to make. The message came on an ordinary afternoon. No explanation. Just a time and a place. A small cafe near the river, neutral ground, public enough to be safe, private enough to matter. I stared at my phone longer than I should have. Then I went. Not because I expected anything, because I owed the truth the courtesy of showing up. She was already there when I arrived, seated by the window, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. She looked different. Not dramatic, not transformed, but lighter, as if something heavy had finally been set down. When our eyes met, the room seemed to recalibrate. We didn't rush. We didn't reach for each other. We smiled, tentative and real, like people who knew how much had been risked to get to that moment. I asked for a separation, she said before I could speak, direct, unembellished. The words landed with a calm that startled me. I felt my breath catch anyway. I didn't announce anything, she continued. No statements, no theater. I just stopped performing. I nodded, listening, careful not to interrupt the steadiness she was building sentence by sentence. I told him I was done pretending my life belonged to the campaign. I asked the question I'd been holding since the moment I sat down. What made you decide now? She didn't hesitate. When you left, she said, meeting my gaze. The quiet was unbearable, not because I was lonely, but because I couldn't lie to myself anymore. Losing you clarified everything. The honesty in her voice loosened something tight in my chest. I hadn't known how much I needed to hear that my leaving had meant something beyond absence. We talked for hours, careful and unguarded. She told me about the negotiations, how even separation had to be framed, managed, softened to protect appearances. How choosing herself felt like learning a new language without a dictionary. I told her about my fear of stepping back into a life that might still be shaped by her gravity. We didn't make promises, we mapped realities. At one point, she reached across the table and took my hand, openly, without checking who might be watching. The contact was simple and grounding, not a declaration, a confirmation. I'm not asking you to fix this, she said quietly. I just want the chance to choose you without hiding. The clarity of it startled me more than urgency ever could. I squeezed her fingers once, steadying both of us. Then we moved slowly, I replied. We don't borrow trouble from the future. We walked by the river afterward, the city moving around us like a living thing. She told me she had retained counsel, that the process would be careful and quiet, that there would be days she needed distance to manage the fallout. I told her I could hold space without disappearing, that I had learned the difference. The relief on her face felt like a small victory. When we stopped, she turned to me with a seriousness that felt earned. I won't ask you to step back into anything that could hurt you, she said. I believed her, not because she promised safety, but because she respected it. That was new, and it mattered. We didn't rush the intimacy. We stood close, our shoulders touching, letting the moment breathe. The kiss that followed was soft and unhurried, like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. It wasn't about reclaiming what we'd lost. It was about acknowledging what we'd survived. When we pulled apart, she smiled, a real one, unguarded. I realized then how different love feels when it isn't practiced in the dark. Later, alone again, I felt something settle that hadn't before, not certainty about outcomes, but confidence in choices. We weren't undoing the past, we were choosing the present with our eyes open. And for the first time, that felt like enough. I went to sleep knowing the story wasn't finished, but it had turned a corner. Whatever came next would be built without secrecy as its foundation. And I understood, quietly and completely, that choosing each other this way, deliberate, honest, patient, was the bravest thing we'd done. I used to think freedom would feel loud, like a declaration, a rupture, a moment that split my life in two. I was wrong. Freedom arrived quietly, the way truth often does when it no longer needs to fight for space. It showed up in the morning light filtering through unfamiliar curtains, in the absence of urgency, in the way my breath settled into my body without instruction. By the time Evelyn finalized the separation, I realized I had already crossed the threshold I'd been afraid of. I was living differently, not cautiously, honestly. We didn't rush to announce ourselves to the world. That kind of performance belonged to another life. Instead, we built something deliberate and private, not hidden, but unexposed, like a garden that doesn't need an audience to grow. Evelyn moved into her own place first, A small apartment near the water, quiet and unremarkable in the best way. I helped her unpack boxes filled with things she'd never been allowed to display. Books she loved, photographs that didn't fit a narrative, pieces of herself she was reclaiming without apology. I noticed the change in her before she did. The way she laughed more easily, the way her shoulders no longer carried the weight of constant calculation. She still had obligations, meetings, lawyers, conversations that required careful language, but she no longer disappeared inside them. She came back to herself, and to me, with a steadiness that felt earned. When she reached for my hand in public now, it wasn't defiance, it was presence. As for me, the transformation was quieter, but just as complete. Without the campaign dictating my rhythm, I had to relearn my own. I took work that aligned with my values. I wrote again, not for approval, not for outcome, but because I remembered that I loved it. Some nights, I still caught myself waiting for instructions that never came. Other nights, I slept deeply for the first time in years. I wasn't invisible anymore, not because I was seen by everyone, but because I finally saw myself. Our intimacy shifted too. It softened, deepened, stretched into something less urgent and more sustaining. We learned each other's mornings, each other's silences, the small rituals that make a life feel shared. Sometimes we talked about the past, not to relive it, but to understand it. Sometimes we didn't talk at all. Love, I learned, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply holds. There were moments when the old fear resurfaced, when a headline brushed too close, when a familiar name appeared in my inbox, when Evelyn hesitated before stepping into a room that once belonged to her husband's world. But those moments passed differently now. We faced them together, without secrecy as our strategy. The absence of hiding changed everything. It didn't make us invincible. It made us aligned. One afternoon, months later, we walked along the river where we'd first spoken openly after my departure. The city looked the same. We didn't. Evelyn stopped and turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever regret how it happened?" she asked. I considered the question honestly. "I regret the fear," I said. "I don't regret the choice." She smiled then, not brightly, but with something steadier underneath. "Neither do I," she said. What surprised me most was how ordinary happiness felt. Not dull, grounded, the kind that doesn't demand proof or witnesses. We cooked together. We argued about trivial things. We made plans that extended beyond crisis. For a long time, my life had been defined by anticipation. What might go wrong? What needed fixing? Now it was defined by participation. I was no longer managing from the edges. I was living from the center. I understood then that loving Evelyn hadn't saved me. It had revealed me. The woman I became wasn't built from sacrifice alone, but from choice. Repeated, conscious, unhidden. I didn't lose myself in her. I arrived at myself with her, and that distinction mattered more than any declaration ever could. On the day her divorce was finalized, there were no speeches. No relief framed as victory. We sat on her balcony, watching the water shift with the light. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and I rested my cheek against hers. The moment didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a line quietly crossed. One we wouldn't need to cross again. If this story has taught me anything, it's this. Love doesn't always ask you to fight harder. Sometimes it asks you to stand still long enough to recognize what's already true. I didn't become brave by staying. I became brave by choosing myself, again and again, until love no longer required me to disappear.